Hey guys, welcome back. I know a lot of you have been asking me about this brand new documentary that came out called Game Changers, and you wanted my thoughts and opinion on it, so here we are. Let's do it. First and foremost, I wore a diet neutral shirt because I want to make it very clear that I'm not anti-vegan or anti-carnivore. Like, I think there's a middle ground that exists, but I think there's a lot of flaws and a lot of misrepresentations that were done in this movie that are likely going to do more harm than good. And that's the only reason I'm addressing this. Otherwise, I wouldn't be wasting my time. Because there was it drew a lot of people's attention, primarily because like the icon of bodybuilding, Arnold Schwarzenegger, was really promoting it, behind it, pushing it a lot. And that was sad to see, right? Like throughout his entire bodybuilding career, he definitely was not vegan or vegetarian. And now he's coming out promoting like this movie and this concept, which really centers around athletes and their ability to perform, I put that in quotations, on a vegan, vegetarian based diet. And so I want to break that down for you guys because I know a lot of you aren't interested in watching the movie. So I want to talk about the main points. Or if you have watched the movie, I want to break down some of the points that they made and try and clarify them, because a lot of them are either just outright false or they're misrepresented and taken out of context. So Team Avocado, I think that's one of the things that we can all agree upon. I want to first start with some positives, right? Some things they did really well. I think the production value of what they created, like the cinematography of it, was well done. They follow around a lot of people, and it's very anecdotal based, which lacks a lot of scientific credibility, but a lot of it's just like, oh, I performed well, I eat vegan, or I switched to a vegetarian or vegan diet, and here's why, and here's how I've seen a lot of success. Lower inflammation, I've been performing better, but a lot of it's just anecdotal, right? But the production value of what they produced was really high. The second one that I think they did really well was getting a lot of social media icons, popular icons on board with the process. Now, how that happened, I'll leave that up for you guys to interpret or figure out. I'm sure there was monetary value involved. But the fact that they got Arnold Schwarzenegger to be a huge proponent behind this is a huge thing, right? He's the icon of muscle. But if you literally watch the entire movie, he's in it for maybe 3 minutes, not a focal point at all of the entire documentary. The other thing is they got a lot of other big name people, Chris Paul, Jackie Chan, listed them as executive producers, but literally had no involvement, weren't even in the film itself. So like literally just leveraging their names to make it seem like, oh, look at all these people who are supportive of this, which they might be. And their whole point in being the executive producers to help get this out, but really had no involvement whatsoever. And then the third thing I think they did really well was that it was comical, right? It was funny, and you'll see why as I start talking about some of these points. They did a good job on their camp arguing and making like visual representations to produce shock value. For me as a scientist, I look at it and it's somewhat comical because like there's a lot of flaws in what they're doing, but like as a person who doesn't know science or a person who's just watching this at home, like I would think of someone in my family watching this, they would be like, oh wow, that makes sense, because it's a shock, right? It's one of those shock features to be like, wow, my blood is cloudy. That's not a good thing. Or, oh, this can have involvement on my sexual life. Oh, that's something I might want to pay attention to. So I'll discuss each of those in a lot more detail, but they did a good job at bringing shock value to people's attention, but it was all taken out of context, misrepresented, and obviously huge flaws with it. So that's what they did on the good side. The thing I'm going to do, I'm going to take some time here with you guys, and I'm going to focus on 10 points they made in chronological order throughout the documentary. So that way, if you're watching it, you can follow along. Or if you're not interested in watching it, you'll basically get an entire gist or summary of what the entire documentary represented. And bring up 10 points. And I'm going to address each one of these 10 points. I have a bunch of notes that I literally just took. I didn't spend a lot of time on this while I was watching this in order to address this and make this video. So the first point that they made was that the Roman gladiators ate primarily vegetarian. And you search this online and you'll see a whole bunch of articles like gladiators ate mainly wheat and barley. They analyzed like a bunch of the bones where these gladiators basically died, and they looked at the bone mineral density of these individuals. They found something called strontium in their bones that's typically high in vegetarians. And so they're alluding to the fact that these Roman gladiators ate primarily vegetarian, which, I mean, without going into too much detail and searching through it, say it is the case. Say they're absolutely right and gladiators were primarily vegetarian. Well, if you look at who gladiators were, they were basically typically prisoners of war and convicts. So the question you have to ask yourself is, were they feeding these individuals really, like, were they feeding them to try and fight and be the best warriors of all time? Or were they like treating them as if they were prisoners of war and convicts? That's something to think about. You look at some of the people who have analyzed gladiators, and this group, the Vienna Team, basically said that if you're a gladiator, one of the reasons you ate foods that caused you to gain weight was so that way you would have a bodily layer of protection, right? If I'm going into war, do I necessarily care about being ripped and being shredded and having an 8-pack? No, I care about having some blubber on my stomach so that way if someone stabs me or I get sliced, it's not as critical and there's a layer of protection to my organs, even though I have a vest over top of me, right? So your nerves are less exposed, your arteries are less exposed. Like, it would make sense if I was a gladiator to have more fat on my body than not, right? So I think that's a weak argument for advocating that the best warriors of all time were eating vegetarian, but it's an argument that they made. And certainly if you go back to hunter-gatherer days, like, they were eating meat. They were eating copious amounts of meat and fat and blubber and all these different things. So the first argument they used was that these Roman gladiators were primarily vegetarian. I just think it's a very weak argument and not one that proves any case that they're trying to make. The second argument is funny, and I was just having a conversation with Mo, the guy who does all of our video, and they use this argument because he's a big Conor McGregor fan. And they use the argument of Conor McGregor, who, if you guys don't know, he's one of the best UFC fighters of all time, fighting against Nate Diaz. Well, Nate Diaz is a vegan, and Conor McGregor is a big meat eater, and he's very open about that. And they use the one fight that Conor McGregor lost to Nate Diaz as an argument showing, like, hey, look, this guy who is vegan is better or superior to the individual who is eating meat. And they take it completely out of context. And I think there's some things that you need to understand to really understand the aspect of this. Well, one, if anyone knows anything about the Nate Diaz-Conor McGregor fight that week, Conor was supposed to be fighting at 155 pounds. He was literally cutting weight to get down to 155 pounds in order to fight a completely different opponent. But at the last minute, that opponent had to back out. And so Nate Diaz, who was fighting at 170 pounds, so he was cutting, Conor was cutting down to 155, Nate Diaz was at 170. Within a week, Conor had to try and regain all this weight that he just went through camp cutting to try and fight Nate at that high level. If you know anything about physiology or changing body composition, to go from cutting down to try and gain weight, Conor was like, oh, I was eating a ton of steak, I was eating a ton of meat. He was eating a ton of food, period, to try and at least somewhat get up to what Nate was fighting at, which was 170 pounds, and he was doing it in a very short period of time. No matter who you are, if you're eating a ton of plants to try and regain that weight, it's not going to be beneficial. And Conor ended up losing that fight, likely because he wasn't ready for it and he was cutting down to 155 and had to fight someone at 170 pounds. It wasn't due to the fact that he was eating steak. It was due to the fact that he was going through extreme cutting right before that fight. And in fact, if you look at it, 5 months later, they had a rematch and McGregor won. He won by a decision and beat Nate Diaz, which they do not mention throughout this film. But I just think it's comical because a lot of people would look at that and unknowingly, not knowing anything about the UFC or that fight, would be like, oh, wow, I've heard of Conor McGregor before. He lost to the only guy he lost to at that time was a guy who was eating vegan, but completely taken out of context. And that's the most frustrating part. You look at people TJ Dillashaw, he's mostly carnivore, and he's big on a ketogenic diet throughout his prep. John Jones eats meat. Khabib eats meat. These are literally the best fighters in the world. And granted, Nate Diaz is a great fighter. He's vegan, which is fine, but like, you can't discount the fact that someone is not a good fighter because they're eating meat, and that's the reason why they lost. So that was completely taken out of context. And I want to put in here, this is funny. Arnold in the movie Escape Plan says to Sylvester Stallone, he goes,
"All right." You hit like a vegetarian.
Which is funny, right? Because now he's coming out with this entire documentary. Maybe he should have stood by that statement. But like, they use that in the movie to kind of make the argument like, oh, look at Nate Diaz beat up Conor McGregor, and but completely taken out of context, right? So that's their second argument. Third argument is this individual they bring in named Scott Jurek. He's an ultra endurance athlete, an ultra marathon runner. You think about it, he was running the Appalachian Trail. Really, he ended up setting the world record, I think, for the Appalachian Trail time trial. And that's like a big focal point. They focus on him and his ability to run on a plant-based diet. He actually ended up tearing his quad while he was on the Appalachian Trail, which kind of makes you think like, nonetheless, he set the record. He ends up finishing it. He finishes and sets the record, I think, by a couple hours. But they're using that as an argument, which isn't a bad argument. Like, hey, people can run and they can do endurance-based athletes on a plant-based approach. What they don't talk about is the amount that he's supplementing on top of that, which I'll get to. The amount that he likely needs to supplement as far as B12 supplementation, protein supplementation, what he does for recovery, and all of those different aspects. I want to provide a counter. You look at an individual, his name's Zack Bitter. He's a 100-mile American record holder. He eats a ketogenic diet, which they bash later on, which I'll talk about. And he talks about this in this interview in the Men's Journal. He says, I'll have eggs and bacon with spinach for breakfast. Lunch is usually a Cobb salad, my man. And his favorite dinner is a tri-tip steak or something like that, right? Clearly a meat eater on a ketogenic diet, and he's literally a American record holder for the 100-mile, and he consistently outperforms his competitors. So it's not like being plant-based is superior, but I can understand the argument they're making. It's possible, and this individual is doing it. So just something to keep in mind, and there's a caveat to that as well. Argument 4. They say the average plant eater gets 70% more protein than is needed, based on what? Who knows? But I'm sure they're alluding to the RDA. Well, first off, let's address that. If you're talking about the RDA is 0.8 grams per kilogram. So let's do the math. If I'm 180 pounds, I divide that by 2.2, that's my weight in kilograms, times 0.8. So for someone like me, that would be the equivalent of 65 grams of protein a day, which is the RDA. The RDA is not meant to even allow you to sustain muscle, let alone build muscle. And for longevity, health, anything. The RDA is set to prevent you from dying, right? Like at bare minimum, you should be consuming 65 grams of protein. For me, someone who's 180 pounds. At bare minimum. That's what the RDA is. So they use this extravagant number to say, oh, you're getting 70% more likely than the RDA. And they bring in this doctor, Dr. James Loomis, who's a team physician for the St. Louis Rams and Cardinals, a former team physician. And he comes in, he says, you don't need meat for energy, you just need carbohydrates, which I'll address. And he goes, protein comes from plants that cows eat. Cows are just the middleman. So he's like, why do we need the middleman? Just cut out the cows and eat the plants directly. And they bring in some other people, a 4 gold medalist, Morgan Mitchell, who's an Australian Olympic athlete, Kendrick Ferris, who's an Olympic weightlifter. And then they bring in this big, strong guy who they make like a focal point, Patrik, I'm going to butcher this, Baboumian. And he says, do you ever see an ox eating meat? But when I stopped eating meat, I got stronger and bigger. So really alluding to the fact that you get plenty of protein through a plant-based approach. One, the amount of plants you need to eat to get the same amount of protein that you would get on a meat-based diet is significantly more. So what they use is they use a cup of lentils versus 3 ounces of beef. If you just want to eat a cup of lentils, which is a large portion, versus a small portion of beef, they're equating to the same amount of protein, which they can make that argument. What they can't make the argument on is the quality of protein and how that differs. So there's studies that show that the muscle protein anabolic response is dictated by the branched chain amino acid content, really the main driver being leucine, the main amino acid that's responsible for driving muscle protein synthesis. Leucine is what is the main driver of muscle anabolism, right? That's what dictates protein quality, is your branched chain amino acid and your leucine content. Now, the leucine content in 1 cup of lentils versus 3 ounces of beef is radically different. So as a reminder, so let me just recap on that. You can have the same amount of protein, but the quality of one protein source is not the same as the quality of another protein source. Just like you can have the same amount of, I can have 100 grams of carbohydrates that are really all sugar versus 100 grams of carbohydrates that are all fiber. They're different quality, though they're technically still 100 grams of carbohydrates. The same goes with plant-based versus animal-based, right? I can have 100 grams of plant-based protein, which would be a lot of plant-based stuff, or 100 grams of meat-based protein, radically different quality of those nutrients. So like the leucine content in a cup of lentils, you're looking at about 1.2 grams, which would not be sufficient for driving an anabolic response in most humans. Maybe in children, but in people who are probably 25 years or older, you need at minimum 2 grams of leucine to drive that response. And studies have shown that. Whereas that 3 ounces of beef, you'd get the 2 to 2.5 grams of leucine in 3 ounces of beef or 3 ounces of eggs. So that's where the misconception is though there may be the same amount of protein, you would need likely 2 cups of lentils, which is a huge proportion, to get the same quality of protein that's actually going to dictate a response as 3 ounces of meat. And so that's the problem, is like, you can't bring up total protein content without context of what quality and the amino acid profile of that protein is. And they did that over and over again throughout this documentary. And that was one of the most frustrating part, because people don't know what they don't know. And the quality is what dictates the response to anything. And so there's a study here that I want to point out by Campbell in 1999 that's titled "The Effects of an Omnivorous Diet Compared with a Lacto-Vegetarian Diet on Resistance Strain-Induced Changes in Body Composition and Skeletal Muscle in Older Men." And they basically fed people a meat-free versus a meat-based diet. They did 12 weeks of resistance training. You look at changes in lean body mass. The people who were eating meat gained about 2 pounds of muscle, while the vegetarian group lost about 1 pound of muscle, right? This makes sense. The protein quality matters, especially the older we get, when we have something known as anabolic resistance, meaning that we don't respond to the same amount of leucine that we did when we were a child, right? When you're a child, you could probably get away and trigger muscle protein synthesis with 1 gram of leucine. As we get older, we might need 3 grams of leucine to trigger that same response that child got with 1 gram of leucine. And yet we completely forget about it. Like, we very rarely talk about how we likely have higher protein requirements as we age, but that never happens, right? We tend to eat less and less as we get older. And now we're bringing into this concept of like eating plant-based sources of protein, which are insufficient in amino acids that drive that muscle protein synthetic response. And that's alarming, because you're at risk of sarcopenia, or age-related muscle loss, fractures, falling, because of a deficiency in amino acids. And I cannot emphasize that enough. And it's frustrating, because it was a point that was made throughout this entire documentary, and one that definitely needs to be clarified, and one that I was really wanted to harp on. You look at this study here. This was actually published by Jacob in the Strength and Conditioning Journal, "The Effects of Amino Acids and Their Metabolites on Aerobic and Anaerobic Sports." The percent leucine of a protein source with like whey protein, with beef and whey, you're getting anywhere from 8 to 11% of that protein is leucine. Whereas with wheat, you're looking at like 6%, 6 to 7%. So that shows you like you almost need double the amount of some of these plant-based sources just to hit the same amount of leucine that you get with an animal-based protein source. And so it's crazy to think about. We're not focusing on the quality, and they often overlook that. Like, you literally need 45 to 50 grams of wheat to get 3 grams of leucine, when you can probably get that same 3 grams of leucine with 25 grams of whey. Think about that for a second. Talk about efficiency. We want to talk, which we'll talk about in a second, about greenhouse gas emissions and protein and food sourcing and having food waste. You want to be efficient with your calories. And that's something that we'll talk about here in a bit. So that was frustrating, and something that I just wanted to talk about. Let's go to argument 5. Eating meat causes your blood to be cloudy, which indicates fat circulating in the blood. And so this is what I meant by the shock factor. They brought in a guy, Dr. Robert Vogel. He's a co-chair of cardiovascular health for the NFL. They brought 3 players from the Miami Dolphins, and they basically had them eat 3 different burritos. 2 of them, I think one of them had beef, one of them had chicken, and one of them was vegan-based, which just had beans. And what they did was they took their blood before, and then they took their blood, like, I think an hour or 2 hours afterwards. And literally what they did was they spun their blood, and they held the blood next to one another, and they said, look at this. This is what happens when you eat the bean burrito. This is what happens when you eat the beef burrito. Look at your blood. It's all cloudy when you eat the beef burrito. Look at how clear it is when you eat the bean-based burrito. And like, they use this as a shock factor, and they said a single animal-based meal impairs endothelial function, and all these different things. And so they bring that up, and all the players are shocked. They're like, wow, I don't want my blood to be cloudy. You're looking at a specific time point. I want there to be triglycerides floating around. For me, it's to induce ketosis. That doesn't affect me. What matters are a bunch of other factors that are available inside of the blood that they did not look at, and they're looking at a specific time point. Like, I could take a meal. I could literally do this exact same thing and look at blood glucose and look at the different effects of blood glucose and be like, look at this. This is your blood glucose when you have a plant-based meal. This is your blood glucose when you have a beef-based burrito. Look at the difference in this, and provide the complete opposite shock value for people who care about their blood glucose, which should be 99% of the population, versus trying to show something that's cloudy versus clear, which really doesn't have an impact on overall health without taking proper context in the situation. Just because someone ate beef, which they didn't talk about if the burritos were the same macronutrients, the same calories, anything like that. But even if the beef burrito had more fat, of course you're going to see more triglycerides floating around the blood. What does that mean? There's nothing you can interpret from that data. And so it's frustrating, but they did a good job trying to make their point and make their case. And it was a good argument for them to provide shock value for people. But people don't know that really means nothing without any context. Here's a study that they bring up. Dr. Scott Stoll brings this study up, and they talk about how a single hamburger increases inflammation. And they're talking about endotoxins and heme iron and being inflammatory. It promotes TMAO, and just eating meat promotes inflammation. So I decided to look into this study, and the study is called Hass Avocados Modulate Postprandial Vascular Reactivity and Postprandial Inflammatory Responses to a Hamburger Meal in Healthy Volunteers. Well, let's break down the study. They took 11 male volunteers. They either consumed a burger with or without an avocado. It wasn't, they ate meat and they became inflammatory. So completely took the study out of context. It was a burger with avocado versus a burger without avocado. And they had not eaten meat 3 days prior to the study. So that could have changed their metabolic response to it, because their body wasn't used to eating meat. And they basically found there were no significant differences in arterial flow. P was greater than 0.05, which I have no idea how they're saying that it decreased vascular reactivity. And there were no differences at all in inflammation except at hour 4, with interleukin 6. At hour 4, the burger by itself had higher amounts of inflammation than the burger with the avocado. So, like, for them to use that as an argument and to make interpretations just drives me insane, because, like, what does that tell you? Cool, having a good amount of potassium and monounsaturated fats with your burger is not a bad idea. Like, that's what I interpret from that study. Great, I'm about to order a burger and get an avocado on the side. I do that all the time. I don't think that makes an argument that meat causes inflammation. I think that says, hey, maybe it's good to throw avocados into your diet, which I'm a huge fan of. So I support that. I think they took the context out of what the study was actually saying. And then they say there's overwhelming evidence connecting animal foods to deadly diseases. If you look at every single one of the studies they cite, there are all correlational studies, which I won't go into too much detail, but like correlational studies, what that does is it means I hand you a survey and say, what do you typically eat? Oh, I go to McDonald's, I have a Big Mac, I do eat this, I go to Chick-fil-A, I have this. And they go, all right, well, you have 4 servings of meat a week versus this person who only has 1 serving of meat, and you have a higher likelihood of deadly disease. That doesn't look at the quality of the macronutrients. That doesn't look at what foods you're eating. It doesn't look at the carbohydrate content. Cool, you're eating a Big Mac. Does that mean you should blame it on the meat? No. There's a million other things you can talk about with the Big Mac, of having the bun and having high fat, high carb at the same time, processed vegetable oils, all of these different things you can take into context, but correlational studies do not take that into account. And that's what they use as their primary evidence. The other thing they said, oh, all the studies that show that meat is safe, it's blamed on the funding. The meat industry funded this. And that argument is, I hate that argument. It's funny because the study that they cited about the single hamburger increasing inflammation, guess who that was funded by? The Haas Avocado Board. And I love the Haas Avocado Board because they obviously support things that I love. But like, clearly, if you're using that as meat people have an agenda to try and do that, you can't then turn around and use a study that an avocado company funded to try and say, oh, avocados are better to be served with burgers than burgers alone. You can't use that point. And they used it. So, frustrating. All right, argument 6. The only diet that has ever been shown to reverse heart disease is a plant-based diet. Guess who this study was by? Dean Ornish, and the study was called "Can Lifestyle Changes Reverse Coronary Heart Disease?" Which it was called the Lifestyle Heart Trial, and they said it was a prospective randomized controlled trial to determine that after 1 year, 28 patients were assigned to either consume a low-fat vegetarian diet in conjunction with stopping smoking, stress management training, and moderate exercise. And guess what they found? 82% of the experimental group had an average change towards regression, meaning they got healthier. They didn't have coronary heart disease anymore. Are we going to attribute that to the low-fat vegetarian diet exclusively? Or are we going to attribute it to the fact that they likely changed their diet, period, from eating junk to eating probably more whole foods in general? They're eating better on the vegetarian, plus they stopped smoking, plus they had stress management, plus they started exercising. Think about that for a second. But yet they contribute this to, it's the plant-based diet that's contributed to reversing the heart disease. You can't make that argument. You literally cannot make that argument. It's frustrating. Then they bring on Dr. Kim Williams. They talk about heme iron. Heme iron is associated with coronary heart disease. Again, a correlational study. They say that people that had higher amounts of heme iron had a 31% increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Correlational study. Guess what's high in heme iron? Big Macs are high in heme iron. Does that mean Big Macs, everyone that's saying that's not eating a plant-based approach is eating Big Macs? No. It's taken out of context. It is a correlational study. And so for those of you who don't know what heme iron is, it's typically found in animal foods, typically red meat. Non-heme iron is typically found in both animals and plants. It can better be absorbed with vitamin C. Long story short, here's the thing. Heme iron is very similar to a lot of other things. You need some too much is probably not great, but too little is not great either. And so you need to get some. And so there's a huge prevalence of anemia. And this was a study published in 2009 looking at 1993 to 2005. And it looks at anemia affects 1/4 of the world's population and is concentrated in preschool age children and women. And they say it's a global public health problem. So not getting enough iron is an issue. I'm more concerned about that because you know what? We have a great way of getting rid of too much iron, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I'm more concerned with people not getting enough iron. Yet they were like, oh, they're making this argument, freaking people out about getting too much iron. Not an issue. I do agree, and this is a point that I do agree, that if you're eating a primarily carnivore or meat-based diet, you should be donating blood. No ifs, ands, or buts. I'm a huge advocate for that. It's something known as iron dumping, especially if you're a male. If you're a female, your body has a natural process that does this every month where you excrete out iron. With males, you don't get that as often. So with a male, if you aren't eating meat, it's simple. Do a good deed. Go donate blood every time you can. And that's what's called iron dumping. You're getting iron out because there are studies that show that like if you can reduce the amount of iron in your blood, there likely is less risk, again, correlational, of like prostate cancer or other types of cancer. So cool. If you eat meat, great. That's not an issue. Go donate blood. But heme iron isn't the problem. I think people not getting enough iron is a bigger problem than people getting too much iron. That's my thought on that approach. What else they talk about? Arnold Schwarzenegger comes on. He says his cholesterol went down. I love meat. I love eating. He didn't say that. He said, I love eating plants much more than I like eating meat. Meat is just a marketing material. And that was about the most of his role. They did a little experiment in firefighters because firefighters tend to have a high amount of heart attacks. So they did a 7-day challenge where all these firefighters went on a plant-based approach. But they all felt better. They interviewed them after. They felt great. They were probably just eating better overall, and by no means is that necessary to attribute to the plant-based diet alone. Dr. Walter Willett said there's a 40% higher risk of cancer in animal-based foods. Again, correlational study. It is literally a correlational study that shows nothing. They said we have longer digestive tracts than carnivores, so we should be eating more like a plant-based approach. I've had several people make the exact opposite argument where our digestive tracts are more similar to carnivores than they are to like gorillas, which have extremely long, small, large intestines that can digest plants and ferment them and create byproducts that are like beneficial, whereas we don't have as long of a digestive tract. So I think that's a weak argument as well. And in fact, if you look at gorillas and chimps, they're mostly herbivores, but they do sometimes eat meat. If you look at them in the wild, I guarantee you they'll eat meat. Also, gorillas and chimps have a low amount of myostatin, which is why you can't make the argument like, oh, look at an ox, look at a gorilla. They don't eat meat. They have a low amount of myostatin. Their hormones are completely different. They have a ton of muscle due to other genetic variables other than their diet. Terrible argument to make. Look at a lion. They eat a ton of meat. They're carnivorous, so you can make the exact counter argument that the king of the jungle is carnivorous, so we should be carnivorous as well. I think it's just a weak argument. There's a new study that just came out, and I've been seeing a lot of people post this, about unprocessed red meat consumption and nutritional guidelines, and I'll post this new study, but basically showing that there shouldn't be a concern, which I know a lot of vegans and vegetarians had problems with, but they just came out with it. It was new recommendations, which I think is the right move. Last three, and I'm gonna kind of go through these quickly because I feel like I've been taking up a lot of your time and I gotta go hop into some other stuff. Argument 7, our brain is desperate for glucose. They say meat isn't good for that. Dr. Mark Thomas said our brain is desperate for glucose. The only thing it takes in for energy is glucose. False. Meat is not a very good source of glucose. Well, you guys, if you watch any of my videos by now, you know where I stand on this. Here's a study that I want to talk about. They said in 3 obese patients undergoing 5 to 6 weeks of starvation demonstrated that beta-hydroxybutyrate replaced glucose as a predominant fuel source for brain metabolism. Interesting, when you fast, beta-hydroxybutyrate becomes the primary fuel source for your brain. Is your brain desperate and absolutely reliant on glucose? No, you guys know this. And here's a good study by my friend Dr. Stephen Cunnane. Ketones compensate for deteriorating brain glucose uptake during aging. As we age, our brain cannot utilize glucose as effectively. Glucose and carbohydrates are not an efficient fuel source for most individuals who are either going through neurodegenerative conditions or who are aging. In which instance, you need to provide an alternative fuel source. That fuel source needs to be ketones, which can be derived exogenously, which can be derived from breaking down fat tissue or breaking down fat and creating endogenous ketones inside of our body to fuel our brain. Our brain can utilize a different fuel source, and it prefers a different fuel source, and that fuel source is ketones. So this geneticist who is talking about our brain is desperate for glucose is just adamantly wrong. The one thing I will say he admitted is that there is a need to supplement vitamin B12 in a plant-based approach, which I'm glad they admitted. They said that people who are meat-based need to do this as well. It's not necessarily true if you have a good whole foods-based approach. I don't think it's a bad thing to supplement as long as you're supplementing with methylcobalamin. It's the bioavailable form of B12. Just make sure you're looking for methylcobalamin. Argument 8. This was the biggest shock factor, one that I'm reluctant to even mention because I think it's so out there and ridiculous, but they said meat messes up erections and the firmness of the penis. So Dr. Spitz, who's the author of the penis book, literally did another experiment for shock value. They took 3 college athletes, they gave them burritos with meat versus a burrito with a plant-based protein. This was, first off, it's not a study, but this experiment was not double-blind. They knew exactly what they were eating. And they basically took this device, put it over the penis, and they looked at how many erections and how firm it was as a result of what they ate for dinner. So these guys literally slept with this device around their penis, looking at erections and firmness. It measures this, I guess, throughout the night. And they saw, guess what they saw that happened? A 477% increase in how many minutes one of the individuals had an erection throughout the night. Amazing, right? Like, so every guy that's watching this is like, oh my gosh, like I need to, if I'm about to go out on a Friday night, I need to make sure I'm eating a bean-based burrito. One, that's not true. There's so many flaws with this experiment. First off, it wasn't randomized. 2, likely what happened is these guys weren't used to sleeping with something on their penis the first night, so they probably didn't sleep well. They didn't look at sleep quality or anything. I would feel uncomfortable with something like the first night, so they got used to it the second night, and on the second night is when they had the plant-based burrito, all of them. So they probably got more comfortable with the device and therefore slept better, therefore had more firmness and erections. So like, I don't even want to go down this rabbit hole anymore. It's a ridiculous study, but again, kudos to their group for trying to make an argument and provide shock value for people that don't know. But it's the entire reason why I'm making this video, to show you how ridiculous it is and point out the differential factors of what actually probably transpired. They talk about there's no differences in testosterone levels in vegans versus carnivores. I can make the argument against that. They talk about how cow's milk can increase estrogen levels. They cite a study called Exposure to Exogenous Estrogen Through Intake of Commercial Milk Produced from Pregnant Cows increased estrogen levels by 27% in 1 hour and dropped testosterone. Very weak study. They used a high amount of cow's milk, from pregnant cows who likely have hormonal things going on as well. There's phytoestrogens in plant-based, in like tofu and soy, which can affect reproductive hormones in young, healthy males. And I'll show studies to support that. There's possible side effects to phytoestrogens in soy, things they kind of just brushed to the side, didn't really talk about, but things that if I were a young male, which I am, I would stay away from. There's no benefit to it. Argument 9, normal carb gain. Normal people who ate carbs gain more muscle mass than individuals on a ketogenic diet. Well, my friend, you just opened a can of worms. One that I wish I had more time to go in on, but it's not even worth it to go too deep in detail on this because there's so much research pointing to the opposite of this that I cannot even express how silly this argument is. They literally bring up a study called The Efficacy of a Ketogenic Diet on Body Composition During Resistance Training in Trained Men. In this study, they say, they show this graph. The normal carb group gained 2.9 pounds of muscle. The ketogenic diet group didn't gain any muscle. Wow, right? Showing that a ketogenic diet, because it's not high in carbohydrates, you aren't able to gain muscle. I embarked on this journey back in 2010 with Jacob. We did the first ever study looking at, can you gain muscle on a ketogenic diet? Before I go into all of the studies that showed that you can gain muscle on a ketogenic diet, the thing they didn't point out from that study is that the ketogenic dieting group lost more fat mass and visceral fat mass than the individuals consuming carbs. So they don't want to talk about that aspect. They only want to talk about the muscle aspect. But even in that study that they cited, their own study that they cited, the ketogenic dieting group lost more fat mass, both regular fat mass and visceral fat mass, which is basically the fat around your organs. But I'll just pull up these studies to make it simple, and we'll link them. Our study, Wilson and Lowery, showed that you can gain just as much muscle on a ketogenic diet and lose significantly more fat mass on a well-formulated ketogenic diet over 10 weeks once you adapt them. Rachel Gregory did a study in CrossFit athletes, looking and found that you can gain just as much lean body mass and lose significantly more fat mass on a well-formulated ketogenic diet. The Auburn group, they did a study showing the exact same thing. CrossFit athletes gain just as much muscle. Our friend Dr. Jordan Joy did plenty of studies looking at not only a ketogenic diet, but a targeted ketogenic diet in a variety of different populations, showing you can gain just as much muscle on a ketogenic diet. The group from Auckland University, this was a kid's master's thesis, showed that you can gain just as much strength on a ketogenic diet as when they were not on a ketogenic diet. Like, I could sit here and go on and on showing studies that are using a well-formulated ketogenic diet. I don't want to digress from the main point of this, which is a plant-based approach, but like, if you want to have a conversation about normal carbohydrate versus a ketogenic diet, that's a totally different discussion. But like, to show one study that and only show part of that study and not show the other 10 studies we can point out showing you can gain just as much muscle on a ketogenic diet, you don't want to go down that route. I want to address something because it's actually funny. They use one of our studies in this documentary. Like, it just flashes up in the beginning. But we did a study looking at rice versus whey protein. And you know what we found? No differences between the ability to recover and gain muscle when you use rice versus whey protein. And so they use that. They go, look it, this study showed you can gain just as much muscle on plant-based protein sources as you can on animal-based protein sources. But they don't take the study into context. And I literally confirmed with the primary author, who's Jordan Joy, myself, and Jacob. It's funny, we all laughed at that because that was literally not the intent of the study at all. And there's a reason why we did this study the way we did. Well, and I'll point out sections from our paper and tell you what the authors actually conclude, not someone who's interpreting what the authors concluded from that study. Plant-based proteins contain approximately 6 to 8% leucine, and in low doses do not increase muscle protein synthesis compared to animal-based proteins. We cite two studies, the Wilkinson study, which I'll pull up here, and the Rasmussen study, which I'll pull up here. Both studies show that at low doses, an animal-based protein can increase muscle protein synthesis, while plant-based cannot. Thus, the study was designed in part to use a superfit, like a large amount, 48 grams of rice protein versus 48 grams of whey protein is what these individuals consumed daily, which is enough to hit the muscle protein synthesis threshold, which would be about a little over 3.5 grams of leucine. And basically what we found was that at that high of a level, once you go over 3 grams of leucine, there's really no difference. That's the interpretation of the study, regardless of the protein source. If you go over the 3 gram of leucine threshold of a protein source, you literally don't see any difference in recovery or body composition. It wasn't that on a gram for gram basis, rice is equivalent to whey. That's what people on the outside want to interpret. That was not our interpretation. It was to interpret the fact that you need 48 grams of rice protein to initiate that response, and so we need to match that with the whey protein group in order to do an effective trial. And so that was taken out of context, and so that's from one of the authors of the study who literally did that study, which, again, it's funny that they used one of our studies. I feel kind of honored in the documentary, but it's interesting nonetheless. Last couple things. They compared meat to cigarettes, which I think is ridiculous. And it's funny because they use Burger King, KFC, McDonald's, all who are now, I believe, offering the Impossible Alien Burger, Beyond Burger, whatever that is. It's funny that they kind of like bash those companies for like their meat ads, but like really right now they're running a bunch of vegetarian ads. It's kind of interesting. One thing I do agree upon is poaching for sport. Like, I don't know why they use this as an argument. I was super confused on what this has to do with eating meat, because it literally, nothing that I'm aware of has to do with eating meat, but like, I think they brought it in for the emotional aspect, but it's something I completely agree with. Like, poaching rhinos' horns for sport, I'm not a fan of and supportive of it, but like, I don't eat rhino meat, so I don't know why they use it as an argument. But I agree. I think they made a good point bringing light to that, awareness of it. So I'm not quite sure why they mentioned the rhino horns, but I agree that we shouldn't be poaching rhinos for their horns. They're beautiful animals. They say livestock require a lot of land, leading to deforestation. This requires a large amount of water. I didn't have time to research this. I do not believe this is the case. They said one hamburger requires 2,400 liters of water. I do not believe that that is the case. I have no idea how they came out with that like that's an absurd number. So if someone can confirm that, I have yet to see anything to confirm 2,400 liters of water is what's needed for one hamburger. I don't think that's true. The last argument I'm going to make to round this up, because it's long and drawn out, is they say meat is a greater contributor to carbon emissions than transportation. First off, that is false. If you look at total greenhouse gas emissions by economic sector, and this is from literally the sources that collect this data, agriculture itself represents 9%. Transportation represents 29%. And the meat industry is not the entire 9% of agriculture. So that's just a false statement. They literally said that 15% of global man-made emissions comes from meat, and it's the same as all transportation, cars, trains, ships. It's not true. That was a false statement. I don't know where they got that data from, but I'm going to I'll put two things in. One, I'll put the link in where I have this conversation with a guest on What the Fat, who literally we talk all about greenhouse gas emissions. I'll also put the link where I break down, like before I even watched this documentary months ago, I do a breakdown of what the actual carbon emissions of one flight that is required to make the Impossible Burger versus someone who eats meat daily. I'll show that away as well. But I want to pop this up. This is from Sustainable Dish. Or sacredcow.info. It's a great resource for people that are looking at the greenhouse gas emissions. Methane claims against cattle are overblown. According to the EPA, all livestock only represent 3.9% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, which is far lower than the 18 to 51% many plant-based advocates report. The largest greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. come from energy and transportation. You look at the difference. Literally, livestock is less than 4%. Less than 4%. So my thing is this. Do I want to save the planet? Absolutely. Do I think focusing on meat and reducing meat consumption, even doing Meatless Mondays, is going to do that? No, and I talk about that with my guest on What the Fat, that you guys can go check out that entire podcast. But is that going to make a significant dent? Likely no. But will walking to work once a week make a dent? Or taking a bike on the weekends? Or not having as many commercial flights to fly all around the world? Or not flying private, like some of these individuals who are huge advocates for this documentary, which is kind of counterintuitive. Flying all around the world, going to all these movie premieres and doing these things. Is that a better approach if your goal is really to lower greenhouse gas emissions? Yes, because that's a lot higher contributor to greenhouse gas emissions than eating beef. And so it's kind of just counterintuitive and something that just doesn't sit well with me, of like people who argue, hey, you know what, we need to reduce meat consumption for greenhouse gas emissions, yet are flying every other day and having a limo drive them around and do all these things. It's like, well, are you really an advocate of that? Or like, are you just saying that because meat's an easy one to point the finger at? But it really wouldn't make a dent. So, long story short, that's my interpretation, summaries, scientific breakdown of what transpired in the movie, The Game Changers. Listen, I try to go into it with as open of a mind as possible. I don't think they did an effective job bringing any science to the table whatsoever. I think they did a great job bringing anecdotes. I think they did a great job bringing shock value to people who do not know or will not ever see this video or will ever have an understanding or care to look into it. So they're going to cause them to go more plant-based. And I'm sure that's a huge agenda and movement that they're trying to do with this film and documentary. But it's sad to see, because what I don't want to see is us go down this path and this trajectory of people going on a vegan or vegetarian approach without proper supplementation and context, because you absolutely need to be supplementing effectively with higher amounts of quality sources of amino acids and essential vitamins like B12 if you're going to choose that route. And I won't judge people for going that route. I just want them to be educated of how to consume it effectively. Otherwise, we're going to go down the spiral of literally people who are going to be breaking bones at 56 years old and having frailty and sarcopenia, which will cost us a lot more in healthcare than it will fixing some of these other problems now with people switching to a plant-based approach. So that's my thing. I mean, I think the plant-based and vegan, you can call it agenda community, did a good job on their part. I wouldn't say it was a good documentary. I think it was very anecdotally based, lacked scientific evidence, that was completely taken out of context. But that's it, guys. I appreciate you guys tuning in. If you've watched it, let me know what your thoughts are below. If you didn't watch it and saw some of these points, let me know what your thoughts are down below. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We'll be doing breakdowns like this as often as needed. But I appreciate you guys. Talk to you soon.